The cabin was quiet, its low hum punctuated by the soft rustle of boarding passengers. Dr. Michael Carter adjusted his leather bag beneath the seat in front of him and leaned back into the plush first-class chair. The faint scent of brewed coffee wafted from the galley, mingling with the crisp sterility of the air conditioning. He glanced to his right, where his wife, Dr. Elaine Carter, sat poised and alert, her tablet resting on her lap. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, and her eyes skimmed a folder of surgical notes with the calm intensity he'd come to admire over their 30 years together. "You're reviewing already?" he asked quietly, though he knew the answer. Elaine didn't look up. "Just one last glance before I tuck it away," she replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Her voice carried the same measured calm she used with nervous patients. Michael let out a soft chuckle, turning his gaze out the window. The ground crew moved briskly below, orange vests bright against the tarmac. He could see the faintest trace of dawn on the horizon, the sky brushed with muted shades of pink and gray. They had been looking forward to this flight to Geneva, a rare break from the relentless schedules of their shared life as cardiothoracic surgeons. The first-class cabin began to fill. A businessman in a tailored suit settled across the aisle, immediately absorbed in his phone. A pair of elderly travelers shared a hushed exchange as they navigated their seats a few rows ahead. Around them, the subtle choreography of air travel unfolded, luggage stowed, drinks offered, safety cards unfolded with mechanical precision. Elaine's voice broke the silence. "Did you pack your slides?" Michael reached for his bag with a faint smile. "Triple-checked. Just like always. But I think you're the star of this trip." "Not me." Elaine rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. Her keynote address at the international conference would spotlight her pioneering work on minimally invasive valve replacement techniques, a procedure that had already begun to reshape patient recovery worldwide. Their quiet moment together was interrupted by the approach of a flight attendant. Her smile was tightly fixed, the corners of her lips stretching into an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She hovered at the edge of their row, her polished uniform crisp but her posture betraying unease. "Excuse me," she began, her tone polite but hesitant. "I need to confirm your seat assignments." Elaine glanced up, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. Michael set down the journal he had been thumbing through, his movements deliberate. "Of course," Elaine said evenly, already reaching for her phone. She pulled up the boarding passes they had received weeks ago, handing the screen to the flight attendant with practiced efficiency. The woman studied it, her smile faltering. "I see," she murmured, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. She glanced back toward the aisle, where a couple stood waiting, a man checking his watch repeatedly while a woman peered past the attendant with thinly veiled impatience. "There's been an issue with our seating arrangements," the flight attendant continued, her voice dropping as if to shield them from the attention of other passengers. "We have a family with young children who were promised upgrades. I was wondering if you might be willing to move to economy. Of course, we'd refund the difference in fare and offer meal vouchers for your trouble." Michael blinked slowly, processing her words. He leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but unyielding. "We're quite comfortable here," he said, his tone measured. "We booked these seats months ago." Elaine nodded, her hand steady as she scrolled through her email. "We selected first class specifically to prepare for our presentations," she added, her voice calm but firm. "Here's the confirmation. Would you like to see the receipt?" The flight attendant hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the waiting couple. "I understand," she said finally, "but we're just trying to make accommodations for everyone." Michael exchanged a glance with Elaine, a wordless conversation passing between them. They had been here before, in conference rooms, at charity galas, even in their own hospital hallways. They knew the shape of this moment, the quiet implication that their presence here was somehow negotiable, an inconvenience to be rearranged. "Sarah," Elaine said, reading the woman's name tag and addressing her with the same calm authority she used in operating rooms. "We're both surgeons on our way to an international conference. Our work is significant, and this time is important to us. I'm sure you'll understand that we'll be remaining in our seats." The attendant's expression tightened briefly before smoothing into professional neutrality. "I'll need to check with my supervisor," she said, retreating down the aisle with quick, Clipped steps. Michael let out a quiet breath, leaning back in his seat. Well, he murmured, his voice tinged with dry humor. At least this time they offered meal vouchers. Elaine's smile was faint but genuine. Progress, she said lightly, though her fingers tightened ever so slightly on the armrest. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, the earlier hum of boarding now replaced by an almost tangible tension. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some feigning indifference, others visibly intrigued. The couple waiting in the aisle had moved forward, speaking in hushed tones with another flight attendant. Michael opened his journal again. Though he didn't read it, his mind lingered on the encounter, on the subtle weight of moments like these, moments that reminded him of all the spaces they had entered where they were expected to justify their belonging. The plane's engines rumbled faintly as the captain announced the final preparations for takeoff. Outside, the first light of day painted the horizon in soft, golden hues. Inside, the quiet murmur of passengers continued, the tension ebbing and flowing like a tide. Michael glanced at Elaine. Her focus had returned to her tablet, her fingers scrolling through surgical diagrams with steady precision. He admired her composure, the quiet strength she carried in moments like these. And yet, as the plane began to taxi down the runway, he couldn't help but wonder how many times must they quietly fight for a space they had already earned. 3/3. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang Tu Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 2. Confrontation in the cabin. The murmurs in the first-class cabin carried a weight that was almost tangible. A quiet ripple spreading outward from the Carter's row. Some passengers turned to glance discreetly over their newspapers or above the edges of their tablets, while others maintained a forced focus on their own belongings, as if ignoring the situation might absolve them of complicity. Dr. Michael Carter remained seated, his posture upright but relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. Beside him, Elaine had returned to her tablet, her focus outwardly fixed on a surgical diagram, though the faint tension in her jaw betrayed her unease. They didn't speak but exchanged a brief glance of practiced, wordless exchange that carried years of shared understanding. A few rows ahead, the elderly couple who had boarded earlier seemed to sense the unspoken tension. The wife leaned in to whisper something to her husband, who nodded solemnly but kept his gaze forward. Across the aisle, a businessman shifted in his seat, his briefcase still perched on his lap as he pretended to scroll through emails. The quiet didn't last long. The sound of measured footsteps heralded the arrival of the flight supervisor. A tall man in a pressed navy uniform whose name tag read, Thomas Miller. His expression was carefully neutral, his professional demeanor polished from years of handling difficult situations. Dr. Carter, he began, nodding at each of them in turn, his voice a smooth tenor meant to disarm. Good morning. I understand there's been some confusion regarding our seating arrangements today. Elaine looked up from her tablet, her expression calm but unwavering. There's no confusion, Mr. Miller, she replied evenly. We booked these seats months ago, and our boarding passes confirm that. Miller nodded, a thin smile appearing briefly before vanishing. I see that, and I do apologize for the inconvenience. However, we have a family with small children who were promised upgrades, and the economy section is currently overbooked. We're hoping to accommodate everyone as fairly as possible. Michael tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and low. Fairly, he repeated, the single word hanging in the air like an echo. Yes, Miller said, his tone faltering ever so slightly. We would, of course, compensate you for the inconvenience. Perhaps an upgrade voucher for a future flight or additional miles on your frequent flyer account? Elaine closed her tablet, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Mr. Miller, she began, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone used to leading teams in high-pressure situations. My husband and I are traveling to an international conference where we'll be presenting research that could impact thousands of lives. We selected these seats because this time is critical for our preparation. I'm sure you understand that moving to a crowded economy section is not an option for us. Miller's smile tightened, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Of course, your work is important, but surely you can review your materials just as effectively in the main cabin. Michael leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely. His 6 feet 2 inches frame gave him an effortless presence, though his tone remained measured. Mr. Miller, my wife and I have spent decades in our profession. We've logged countless hours in operating rooms, trained the next generation of surgeons, and developed techniques that are saving lives as we speak. These seats aren't a luxury for us, they're a necessity. And we have no intention of moving. The clarity of his words seemed to hang in the air, drawing the attention of more passengers. The businessman across the aisle set down his phone, his expression shifting from feigned indifference to mild curiosity. A young man a few rows back removed his earbuds, his gaze darting between Michael and Miller. Miller hesitated, glancing toward the front of the cabin where the waiting family stood with their carry-on bags. The mother held her youngest child, her expression flickering between impatience and discomfort. Elaine's voice broke the silence. If there's truly an overbooking issue, I suggest looking for volunteers elsewhere, she said, her tone steady but firm. I'm sure there are passengers who'd be happy to accept your generous compensation. But we will be remaining in our seats. The supervisor opened his mouth as if to respond but stopped short. His gaze flicked to Michael, who met it steadily, and then to Elaine, whose calm resolve was unshakable. I'll review our options, he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, with a slight bow of his head. He turned and retreated down the aisle, his polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet. The tension in the cabin lingered, a quiet hum of unspoken thoughts and unsaid words. Michael picked up his journal again, flipping to the marked page, though his eyes remained unfocused on the text. Beside him, Elaine reopened her tablet, her fingers scrolling through the surgical notes with practiced precision. Across the aisle, the businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at them briefly before returning to his phone. The elderly couple exchanged another quiet glance, the wife reaching over to pat her husband's hand. It was a familiar rhythm, this unspoken dance of tension and silence. Michael and Elaine had faced it countless times before in boardrooms, hospitals, even social gatherings. The settings changed, but the undercurrent remained the same, the quiet assumption that their belonging in certain spaces was negotiable. Conditional, something to be questioned rather than accepted. Michael let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting back out the window. The plane had begun to taxi, the engines humming softly as the runway lights flickered in the distance. Beside him, Elaine reached over, her hand resting lightly on his. He squeezed it gently, their silent gesture of solidarity. It's always the same, he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Elaine nodded, her gaze fixed ahead. Yes, she said quietly, but it's not ours to carry alone. The plane gathered speed, lifting into the early morning sky. In the cabin, the hum of the engines masked the undercurrent of shifting awareness, a subtle ripple as passengers processed what they'd seen and heard. For Michael and Elaine, it was another moment added to the ledger. Another quiet confrontation resolved without fanfare but not without cost. They sat together in silence, the clouds stretching endlessly outside their window, as the flight climbed higher into the pale blue sky. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 3 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song HangEnge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 3. The Catalyst. The flight settled into a steady rhythm, the hum of the engines providing a backdrop to the subdued murmur of conversation and the occasional chime of a flight attendant call button. Dr. Michael Carter flipped through the pages of his journal, though his eyes barely scanned the words. Beside him, Elaine had resumed her review of surgical notes, the glow of her tablet reflecting off her glasses. From the corner of his eye, Michael noticed a young woman rise from her seat several rows back. She moved hesitantly, clutching a tablet to her chest. Her casual jacket couldn't quite conceal the scrubs she wore underneath. For a moment, she paused in the aisle, glancing toward their row with a mix of nervousness and determination. Michael set his journal aside, watching as the young woman approached. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, almost hesitant. "Excuse me," she said, her gaze darting between Michael and Elaine. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but, are you Dr. Elaine Carter? The one who developed the modified valve replacement technique?" Elaine looked up, momentarily startled by the recognition. "Yes," she said after a pause. Her tone measured. The woman's face lit up, her earlier hesitation giving way to excitement. "I thought so. I've been studying your work as part of my cardiology fellowship. Your research has completely changed how we approach valve replacement in my program." She glanced at Michael, her expression brightening further. "And you must be Dr. Michael Carter. Your paper on minimally invasive bypass techniques was groundbreaking. It's required reading for all of us." Michael exchanged a glance with Elaine, his expression softening. He gestured toward the empty seat beside them. "Why don't you sit for a moment? What's your name?" "Dr. Samantha Lynn," she replied quickly, taking the offered seat. "I'm in my second year of fellowship at Northwestern." Elaine nodded, her tone warm but calm. "It's always good to meet someone passionate about the field. What's your focus?" As Samantha spoke, her initial nervousness faded, replaced by a professional enthusiasm that seemed to brighten the cabin. She described her ongoing research on post-operative recovery outcomes, citing both of the Carters' work as foundational to her studies. "We've been implementing some of your protocols in our ICU," Samantha explained, her voice gaining confidence. "The results have been remarkable. Recovery times have decreased significantly, especially for high-risk patients." Elaine leaned slightly forward, her interest genuine. "What specific protocols have you found most effective?" The conversation flowed easily, a quiet exchange of ideas and experiences that felt more like a mentoring session than a chance encounter. Around them, passengers began to take notice. The businessman across the aisle, who had previously been absorbed in his phone, now glanced up, his curiosity piqued. A retired nurse seated nearby leaned in subtly, clearly following the discussion. It wasn't long before other passengers began to recognize the significance of the exchange. A woman 2 rows ahead whispered to her seatmate, gesturing discreetly toward the Carters. "That's the couple I read about in the news," she murmured. "They've saved so many lives with their techniques." A ripple of quiet recognition spread through the cabin. Some passengers pulled out their phones, searching for articles and videos about the Carters. Others listened openly, their earlier indifference replaced by admiration. Michael noticed the shift but didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he focused on Dr. Lynn, his tone encouraging. "Have you considered tracking inflammatory markers at shorter intervals? It might give you more granular data on recovery trends." Samantha's eyes widened. "That's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that." Elaine smiled faintly, her voice carrying a note of quiet pride. "You're doing important work, Dr. Lynn. The field needs fresh perspectives like yours." As the conversation continued, a flight attendant approached with a tentative smile. "Dr. Carter, Dr. Carter," she said softly, addressing them both. "Can I get you anything? Perhaps some champagne or a special meal?" Michael shook his head politely. "Water is fine, thank you. We need to stay clear-headed for the conference." The attendant nodded quickly, her demeanor markedly different from earlier in the flight. It was a shift the Carters had seen countless times before, the subtle transformation from skepticism to respect, from dismissal to deference. Nearby, the retired nurse spoke up, her voice tinged with admiration. "I worked in cardiac care for 30 years. What you've done for this field, it's extraordinary. I wish we'd had those techniques when I was practicing." Michael offered a small, gracious smile. "Thank you. We stand on the work of those who came before us." The nurse nodded, her expression warm. "Still, you've changed so many lives. You should be proud. As the conversation in the cabin grew, the supervisor, Mr. Miller, passed through on his routine check. His earlier confidence had softened, his demeanor now careful and subdued. He paused near their row, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Carter," he said quietly, his gaze shifting between Michael and Elaine. "I want to apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. I hope you're comfortable." Elaine looked up, her expression calm but firm. "We're fine, thank you." Miller nodded, hesitating for a moment before continuing down the aisle. The cabin had shifted entirely from what it had been just an hour earlier. What had started as a quiet tension, heavy with unspoken assumptions, had transformed into a space of shared respect and recognition. Passengers who had once avoided eye contact now leaned in to listen, their curiosity sparked by the Carters' quiet presence and undeniable expertise. Elaine glanced at Michael, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It seems word travels fast," she said softly. Michael returned the smile, his gaze steady. "Sometimes it takes a moment for people to see what's right in front of them." The plane continued its journey, the sky outside deepening into a soft, endless blue. Inside, the cabin hummed with quiet conversation, the earlier discomfort replaced by something closer to understanding. For Michael and Elaine, it was a small but meaningful shift, another reminder of the barriers they had faced and the doors they continued to open. One flight, one conversation at a time. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 4 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Nghe La Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 4. Shared Legacy. The hum of the engines was steady and familiar, a sound that wrapped the cabin in an unspoken rhythm. Most passengers had settled into their routines, reading, watching movies, or dozing, but for those seated near the Carters, a quiet ripple of interest lingered. Dr. Samantha Lynn, her earlier hesitation now gone, had remained in the empty seat beside them, her tablet open and filled with notes. Michael leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but intent. "When you adjusted your post-operative protocol, what specific metrics did you focus on first?" Samantha's fingers hovered over her screen, scrolling to a graph she'd prepared. "We started with inflammatory markers and patient-reported pain levels, but I'm beginning to think we didn't track them closely enough in the first 72 hours. That seems to be where the biggest variations occur." Elaine nodded thoughtfully. "It's a crucial window. Patients' initial recovery trajectory can dictate their outcomes weeks down the line. Have you considered stratifying by pre-operative risk factors?" Samantha's eyes lit up. "That's an excellent idea. It could help us refine the data even further." Their conversation was quiet, almost clinical, yet it carried a weight that wasn't lost on those nearby. A woman across the aisle, who had been following discreetly, leaned over. "I don't mean to interrupt," she began, her voice tentative, "but I just wanted to say thank you. My brother had a valve replacement last year, and it was your technique, Dr. Carter. His recovery was incredible, so much faster than anyone expected." Elaine offered a polite but genuine smile. "I'm glad to hear he's doing well. Stories like his remind us why we do this work." The woman nodded, her eyes slightly moist. "It's more than just work. You've given people like my brother a second chance." The acknowledgement hung in the air, touching but understated. Michael shifted in his seat, glancing briefly out the window before turning back to Samantha. "It's one of the reasons we mentor young physicians. Every advancement is a team effort, built on the work of others." Samantha smiled, her earlier nervousness replaced by gratitude. "It's incredible to think about how interconnected it all is. Your research directly influenced mine, and now I'm presenting findings that might build on your work." Elaine gestured toward the graphs on Samantha's tablet. "It's a continuum," she said softly. "Every contribution matters, no matter how small it feels at the time." Across the aisle, the businessman who had spent the earlier part of the flight absorbed in his laptop leaned forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tentative but earnest. I don't mean to eavesdrop. But I've been reading about your work since the conversation started. It's fascinating. My company invests in medical technology. And what you're doing could shape the future of the industry. Michael offered a measured nod. It's always encouraging to see support for innovation in medicine. The work requires resources, collaboration, and time, none of which are easy to come by. The businessman hesitated before adding, if you're open to it, I'd love to discuss ways my company could support your research. Michael exchanged a glance with Elaine, who gave a subtle nod. We'd be happy to share insights. He replied, the more minds involved in advancing the field, the better. As the conversation continued, the retired nurse seated a few rows ahead turned to join in. I worked cardiac care for decades, she said. Back then, we didn't have these kinds of options for patients. It's incredible to see how far we've come. Elaine's smile softened. Your work laid the foundation for what we're doing now. Every patient you cared for, every lesson you passed on, it all matters. The nurse's expression grew thoughtful, her voice quieter. It's easy to forget that when you're in the thick of it. But hearing all this now, it feels good to know it made a difference. The cabin felt different now. Quieter in a way that wasn't simply about noise. The earlier tension from the seating confrontation had dissolved, replaced by a shared awareness of the impact the Carters had made. Passengers who might have dismissed them earlier now listened intently, their expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. Michael leaned back in his seat, letting the conversation flow around him. He had seen moments like this before, moments when assumptions gave way to understanding. When the weight of their accomplishments began to shift the narrative. But it wasn't lost on him that these moments always came at a cost. It wasn't enough to simply do the work. They had to prove themselves. Over and over, in spaces where their presence was questioned before their contributions were even considered. Elaine seemed to sense his thoughts. She touched his arm lightly, her fingers warm and steady. It's not just about us, she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Michael nodded, his gaze drifting to Samantha, who was still animatedly discussing her research. No, he agreed. It's about what comes next. The plane cruised steadily at altitude, its path unwavering even as the conversations inside the cabin wove a tapestry of past, present, and future. Michael and Elaine had always known their work extended beyond the operating room into classrooms, journals, and the lives of young physicians like Samantha Lynn. For those who sat around them now, the Carters were more than just passengers on a flight to Geneva. They were a reminder of resilience, of excellence quietly pursued despite the subtle barriers that sought to limit it. And for Michael and Elaine, this was the legacy they had always hoped to leave, not just breakthroughs in medicine but a path forward for those who would follow. As the discussion ebbed, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition to the evening portion of the flight. Elaine closed her tablet, resting her hands in her lap. Another small step, she murmured, glancing at Michael with a faint smile. He returned the smile, his expression calm but resolute. One of many, he replied. Outside, the sky stretched wide and endless, the faint curve of the earth visible against the horizon. Inside, the quiet hum of connection and shared purpose filled the cabin, a subtle but significant shift in the atmosphere. The Carters had seen it before, and they would see it again, a reminder that even the smallest moments could carry the weight of progress. Reshaping perceptions one conversation at a time. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tiang An Viet Chuang 5 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 5. The Quiet Night. The soft glow of the overhead cabin lights dimmed as the plane settled into the rhythm of a long-haul flight. Passengers adjusted their seats, donned eye masks, and whispered good nights to one another. The stillness of the night flight was a comfort to most. But for Dr. Michael Carter and Dr. Elaine Carter, it was a familiar space for quiet reflection. Elaine closed her tablet, setting it neatly on the tray table in front of her. She leaned back into her seat, her hands folded in her lap. Michael glanced over, sensing the slight tension in her posture. "You're not really resting, are you?" he asked, his voice low and even. She smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just thinking," she replied. He didn't press her further, knowing she would speak when she was ready. Instead, he returned to his journal, flipping through the pages without really reading them. Around them, the hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop, punctuated occasionally by the rustle of a blanket or the muffled cough of a fellow passenger. After a long silence, Elaine spoke. "Do you remember the first time I was asked to move during a conference?" Michael set the journal down, turning his full attention to her. "Chicago, wasn't it? The charity gala?" She nodded, her gaze distant. "They wanted to seat me at the back of the room, near the kitchen, said the front tables were reserved for important guests." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of weariness in her tone. Michael's jaw tightened slightly. "Until they realized you were the keynote speaker." Elaine let out a soft breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Exactly. Suddenly, I wasn't just Elaine Carter. One was Dr. Elaine Carter, chief of cardiothoracic surgery, and everything changed. But only after I had to explain myself." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. It was a story they both knew well, one that had played out in countless variations throughout their careers. Michael reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You shouldn't have to keep proving yourself," he said quietly. Elaine squeezed his hand in return. "Neither should you," she replied, her voice softer now. Across the aisle, a businessman stirred in his sleep, his laptop still open on the tray table in front of him. The screen displayed an article about the Carters' groundbreaking research, the headline glowing faintly in the dim light. Elaine's gaze drifted toward the young Dr. Samantha Lynn, who had fallen asleep in the seat beside them. Her tablet was still on, displaying a detailed chart of her research findings. Elaine smiled faintly. "She reminds me of myself," she said, almost to herself. Michael followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "She's lucky to have someone like you to look up to." Elaine shook her head gently. "She has the drive, the talent. What worries me is whether she'll have the strength to endure what comes with it." Michael's brow furrowed. "You mean the biases, the assumptions, the constant need to be twice as good to be seen as equal?" Elaine finished, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "It wears you down, Michael. You know that as well as I do." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a heavy burden," he admitted, "but it's also why we keep going. To make it lighter for the ones who come after us." Elaine leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closing briefly. "Sometimes I wonder how many didn't make it. How many brilliant minds gave up because they got tired of fighting." Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window at the vast expanse of darkness beyond, the faint glow of city lights far below. "Too many," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But that's why we keep opening the doors, isn't it?" Elaine's eyes opened again, and she turned to look at him. "You've always been the optimist," she said with a faint smile. Michael chuckled softly. "One of us has to be." The plane hit a slight patch of turbulence, causing a few passengers to stir. But the Carters remained steady. They had weathered far greater storms than this. The conversation lulled into silence once more, each lost in their own thoughts. Elaine's mind wandered to the young surgeons she had mentored over the years, the students who had entered her operating room with wide eyes and nervous hands. She thought of the moments when she'd seen the spark of understanding in their expressions, the first time they realized they were capable of something extraordinary. Michael's thoughts drifted to his own experiences, moments of triumph tempered by the quiet reminders that his presence was often seen as an exception rather than the norm. He thought of the countless introductions where his title had been met with surprise, the subtle shifts in tone when people realized who he was. "It shouldn't be this way," Elaine said suddenly, breaking the silence. Michael turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "No, it shouldn't," he agreed. "But every step forward matters. Every door we push open stays open for someone else." Elaine nodded slowly, her gaze returning to Samantha, still sleeping peacefully. I just hope it's enough. The hum of the engines filled the quiet once more. A steady reminder of their journey not just to Geneva, but through the years of barriers, breakthroughs, and quiet battles. For Michael and Elaine, this flight was another moment in a long continuum, a reminder of where they'd come from and what they still hoped to achieve. Outside, the faint glow of dawn began to touch the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained calm, the earlier tensions long forgotten. But for the Carters, the weight of the night lingered, a quiet reminder that the journey toward equality was far from over. And yet, they sat side by side, resolute in their shared purpose, ready to face whatever lay ahead. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 6 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Vanda Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Illinois Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 6. Dawn of Understanding. The first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon, soft strokes of gold and lavender that reflected off the airplane's wing. The cabin, bathed in the dim blue glow of the early morning lights, stirred gently as passengers began to rouse from their slumber. For Dr. Michael Carter and Dr. Elaine Carter, the night had been long but not unusual, marked by quiet reflection, shared glances, and unspoken understanding. Michael adjusted his seat, stretching his legs slightly as he glanced at Elaine. She was awake, her gaze distant, though her hands rested lightly on the tablet in her lap. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking, after so many years together. He could read her thoughts in the slight tension of her shoulders and the way her lips pressed into a faint line. Another day, he said softly, breaking the silence between them. Elaine turned to him, her expression calm but thoughtful. Another day, she echoed, and another stage. She was referring to the conference in Geneva, where they would present their latest research. It was a moment they had worked toward for months. Yet the weight of the journey felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the encounter with the flight attendant earlier. Or perhaps it was the quiet conversations that had followed, the reminders of how their presence in spaces like this still required explanation. Justification. A flight attendant approached, her movements quieter than usual as she offered coffee and tea to the slowly waking passengers. Her earlier hesitation had vanished, replaced by a tentative warmth. When she reached the Carters' row, her voice was low but genuine. "Good morning, Dr. Carter. Can I bring you anything to start your day?" Elaine smiled politely. "Just coffee, thank you." Michael declined, returning to his journal. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say more but wasn't sure how. Finally, she added, "I read about your work last night. It's incredible what you've accomplished." Elaine's smile didn't waver, though her tone remained measured. "Thank you. We've been fortunate to have the resources and opportunities to make a difference." The flight attendant nodded quickly, almost nervously, before moving to the next row. As she disappeared down the aisle, Michael closed his journal and turned to Elaine. "It's always the same, isn't it? Once they see the credentials, the tone shifts." Elaine took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle before responding. "It's not malicious," she said quietly. "It's just instinct. Assumptions people don't even realize they're making." Michael leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the streaks of light outside the window. "It doesn't make it less exhausting." "No," Elaine agreed, "but it's why we keep going." The cabin began to come alive as more passengers stirred. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spent much of the flight researching the Carters now gave them a small nod of acknowledgement. It was a subtle gesture, but Michael recognized it for what it was: respect. Belated but sincere. Further ahead, the retired nurse who had shared her thoughts on cardiac care the night before turned in her seat to address them again. "Dr. Carter, I wanted to thank you for what you said last night, about every contribution mattering. It reminded me of why I chose this field in the first place." Elaine nodded, her smile faint but warm. "The work you did laid the groundwork for everything we've accomplished. It's all connected." The nurse's eyes glistened slightly. It's easy to forget that in the moment. Thank you for reminding me. As the plane began its gradual descent, the atmosphere in the cabin felt markedly different from the night before. The initial tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet camaraderie. Passengers who had previously kept to themselves now exchanged nods and smiles, as if the shared journey had brought them closer in some unspoken way. Michael turned to Elaine, his voice low. Do you think it lasts? This understanding? Elaine tilted her head slightly, considering the question. I think it's a start. Moments like these, they plant a seed. Whether it grows, that's up to them. He nodded, his gaze distant. Still, it feels like we're always planting seeds. When do we get to rest? Elaine reached over, placing her hand lightly on his arm. Maybe we don't, but we get to see what grows because of it. That's enough for me. Ahead of them, Dr. Samantha Lynn stirred, blinking awake as the announcement for landing crackled through the cabin. She stretched, her tablet still open on her lap, and turned to the Carters with an apologetic smile. I must have dozed off, she said. I hope I didn't miss too much. Elaine shook her head. Not at all, but I'd love to hear more about your plans for that recovery study when we land. Samantha's face brightened, her earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet determination. Absolutely. Your feedback would mean everything. As the plane descended through the clouds, the morning sunlight filled the cabin with a soft, golden light. Michael glanced around, taking in the faces of the passengers who had watched, listened, and perhaps learned something during the course of the flight. It was a small step, but one that felt significant. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, and the cabin erupted in the familiar sounds of seatbelts clicking open and overhead bins being unlatched. As the Carters gathered their belongings, several passengers stopped to offer words of thanks, admiration, or quiet recognition. Each interaction was brief but meaningful, a reminder of the impact they had made even in the smallest moments. As they stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Elaine turned to Michael with a faint smile. Another stage, she said, echoing her words from earlier. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful but resolute. And another chance to plant a seed. Together, they walked toward the gate for the conference, the hum of the airport blending into the rhythm of their shared journey one step at a time. Each one carrying the quiet weight of change. 4-0. Van Da Noi. Bang Tieng An Viet Chuang 7 Hap Dan Gun Hut Noi Dak Bang Jiang Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan. Jiang Van Kua Kao Choyan Kong Kwa Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Bin Than. Tram Lang. Nyan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Kua Van Da Fan Biat Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hang Enge. Doi Tuong Noi Ngh Hila Noi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tui Trend 65 Tui. Chat GPT Da Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 7. The First Impressions. The terminal in Geneva was awash with the bustle of early morning arrivals. Suitcases rolled across gleaming floors, punctuating the soft murmur of travelers reuniting or hurrying toward connecting flights. Dr. Michael Carter and Dr. Elaine Carter walked side by side, their steps unhurried yet purposeful, their expressions calm and unreadable. It was a rhythm they had perfected over decades, navigating public spaces with quiet dignity, even when the world around them questioned their belonging. Elaine adjusted her coat, glancing briefly at Michael. Did you notice the whispers? She asked softly, her voice barely above the hum of the crowd. He nodded, his eyes scanning the terminal ahead. It's always the same. Curiosity, then recognition. They approached the baggage carousel, where a conference representative stood holding a sign that read Dr. Michael and Dr. Elaine Carter. The woman's smile was polite but professional, her expression lighting up as she recognized them. Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter, she greeted warmly, extending a hand. Welcome to Geneva. We're honored to have you both. The conference committee has been eagerly anticipating your presentations. Elaine shook the woman's hand, her own grip firm yet graceful. Thank you. We're looking forward to it as well. Michael's acknowledgement was equally composed, his voice steady. It's a privilege to share our work with colleagues. As the representative led them toward a waiting car, the Carters noticed subtle glances from other travelers. Some were discreet, others more open. A few faces lit up with recognition. followed by quick murmurs exchanged between companions. They've already read about us, Elaine said quietly, her tone neutral. Michael gave a faint smile. It's different here. The audience knows why we're here before we have to explain it. The car waiting for them was sleek and understated. The type of vehicle chosen for practicality rather than ostentation. As they settled into the backseat, Elaine glanced at the folder on her lap, filled with final notes for her keynote presentation. She opened it, flipping through pages she had reviewed countless times, her fingers pausing on a particular diagram. You've rehearsed it enough, Michael said gently, his voice carrying the weight of reassurance. Elaine smiled faintly. Habit. I've learned not to take anything for granted. The drive to the conference center took them through the quiet streets of Geneva, where the early sunlight glinted off rooftops and reflected in the still waters of the lake. The calm outside was mirrored in their demeanor, though beneath the surface lay the familiar tension of preparing to take the stage. As the car approached the conference venue, the energy shifted. Colleagues and attendees gathered in small groups, their badges and lanyards identifying them as part of the international medical community. The Carters stepped out of the car, their presence drawing immediate attention. A young doctor, barely out of residency, approached hesitantly. Dr. Carter? She asked, looking between them. I just wanted to say how much your work has inspired me. I'm presenting a poster tomorrow, and your research played a huge role in shaping it. Elaine offered a gracious smile. I look forward to seeing your work. What's your focus? The young doctor's face brightened as she launched into an explanation of her study on reducing surgical trauma in high-risk patients. Michael listened attentively, his occasional nods encouraging her enthusiasm. It sounds like you're asking the right questions, he said when she paused, his voice calm but firm. That's how progress begins. The conversation ended with the doctor expressing her gratitude before hurrying off to join her group. As Michael and Elaine entered the conference center, they were greeted by a wave of polite applause from colleagues who had gathered near the entrance. Inside, the space was a blend of modern design and quiet professionalism, with large screens displaying session schedules and speaker profiles. The Carters' names appeared prominently, accompanied by summaries of their groundbreaking research. As they moved through the crowd, familiar faces greeted them with handshakes and warm words of acknowledgement. Yet, in the background, there was an undercurrent of quiet observation, subtle reminders that even among peers, their presence carried a weight of expectation. Michael leaned toward Elaine as they approached the lecture hall. Do you feel it? He asked softly. She nodded, her expression calm. Always. It's not just about what we present. It's about who we are presenting it as. The room for Elaine's keynote address was large but intimate, designed to foster focus and engagement. As attendees filled the seats, Michael took his place near the front, his quiet support evident even as he blended into the audience. When Elaine stepped to the podium, the room hushed. She began with the same measured tone she always used, her words deliberate but not dramatic. She spoke of surgical innovation, of patient outcomes, and of the importance of collaboration across disciplines. But as she progressed, a subtle shift occurred. Her words, though clinical, carried a deeper resonance. She didn't speak of the barriers she had faced, but they lingered in the pauses between sentences, in the calm authority of her voice, in the precision of her gestures. The audience responded in kind, focused, respectful, and quietly moved. When the session ended, the applause was immediate and sustained. Elaine stepped back from the podium, her expression serene, though Michael recognized the faint relief in her eyes as she returned to his side. You made it look effortless, he said softly. Elaine gave a small smile. It never is, but thank you. As the day continued, the Carters moved through the conference, engaging in discussions and fielding questions. The interactions were professional, yet beneath the surface lay the quiet acknowledgement of their journey, not just as doctors, but as pioneers in a space that had not always welcomed them. By the time evening arrived, the Carters found a moment to themselves in a quiet corner of the venue. Elaine leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. It's always the same, she said after a moment. Michael tilted his head slightly. What is? The balance, she replied, between being seen for the work we've done and being seen for who we are. Sometimes I wonder which one matters more to them. Michael considered her words before responding. Maybe it's both. And maybe that's what makes it so hard. But it's also what makes it worth it. Elaine nodded, her gaze distant. Another seed planted, she murmured. Michael reached for her hand. His grip steady. Another step forward, he said. As the lights dimmed in the conference hall, the Carters sat together in quiet companionship. For them, the journey was far from over. But in that moment, they allowed themselves a brief pause, a reminder of how far they had come. And how much further there was to go. 4-0. Van da noi. Bang tieng an viet chuang 8 hap dan gun hut noi dak bang jiang van tram lang. Kak quan. Jiang van kua kao choyan kong qua kich tin ma ko fan bin than. Tram lang. Nyan man su mao thuan gom kua vanda fan biat chung tak trong doi song hang enge. Doi tuong noi ngh ila noi sin song tai mai va ko du tui trend 65 tui. Chat GPT da noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 8. The hardest seats to hold. The closing ceremony of the conference was a subdued but dignified affair. Attendees mingled in small groups, their conversations filled with reflections on the past few days. For Dr. Michael Carter and Dr. Elaine Carter, the atmosphere was familiar, a blend of professional respect and quiet expectation. They had long since grown used to the dual roles they occupied, esteemed experts in their field and unspoken symbols of progress. Elaine sat at a round table near the center of the hall, a cup of tea in her hand, her posture relaxed but alert. Michael stood nearby, engaged in a quiet discussion with a small group of young surgeons. His tone was calm and measured, his gestures subtle but expressive, as he answered their questions with the patience of someone who had been in their shoes decades earlier. Elaine watched him for a moment, her gaze softening. "You're a natural teacher," she said when he returned to her side. Michael smiled faintly, sitting beside her. "And you're the better speaker. You had them captivated today." Elaine shook her head slightly. It wasn't just the speech. It was the work. That's what they came for. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but it's never just the work. Is it?" Elaine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts. Around them, the room hummed with quiet energy, colleagues exchanging farewells and promises to stay in touch. "It's always about more than the work," she said finally. "But that's what we signed up for." Michael nodded, his gaze distant. "Do you ever wonder if it's enough? The lectures, the research, the mentoring, does it really change anything?" Elaine set her cup down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Not everything," she admitted, "but it changes something, for someone, and sometimes, that's all you can do." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Samantha Lynn, her face bright with excitement. "Dr. Carter, Dr. Carter," she began, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "I just wanted to thank you again for your feedback. It helped me refine my presentation. And I actually had 3 senior physicians ask for a copy of my study." Elaine smiled warmly, gesturing for Samantha to sit. "That's excellent news. What did they say?" Samantha sat down eagerly, recounting the details of her discussions with a blend of professionalism and nervous energy. Michael listened attentively, nodding occasionally, while Elaine offered quiet encouragement. "You're making an impact," Elaine said when Samantha finished. "That's what matters most." Samantha hesitated, her expression growing more serious. "It's because of you," she said softly. "Seeing you both, hearing your stories, it reminded me that it's possible to break through, even when it feels impossible." Michael glanced at Elaine, their eyes meeting briefly. It was a look they had exchanged countless times before, a silent acknowledgement of the weight they carried and the reasons they continued to carry it. "You'll have your own stories to tell one day," Michael said to Samantha, his tone steady but kind. "And someone else will look at you and see what's possible." Samantha's smile returned, though her eyes glistened slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere, "for everything." As Samantha left to rejoin her colleagues, Michael and Elaine sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the room fading into the background. Outside the large windows, the evening sky stretched wide and deep, its colors shifting from gold to indigo. It's always the next generation. Michael said softly. They're the ones who'll carry it forward. Elaine nodded, her gaze distant. And we'll always be the ones who had to prove it could be done. The weight of her words settled between them. Heavy but not unbearable. It was a truth they had lived with for so long that it had become almost second nature. Woven into the fabric of their lives and work. As the conference began to wind down, attendees trickled out of the hall, their voices growing fainter with each passing moment. Michael and Elaine gathered their belongings, their movements unhurried but deliberate. They had long since learned the value of pacing themselves. On the drive back to their hotel, the quiet of the car felt like a welcome reprieve. Elaine leaned her head against the window, watching the lights of the city blur into streaks of color. Michael sat beside her, his thoughts turned inward. When they reached their room, Elaine set her bag on the desk and turned to Michael. Do you think they'll remember us? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Michael paused, considering her question. They'll remember what we've done, he said, and if they don't remember us, that's fine, as long as the work lives on. Elaine smiled faintly. You've always been more practical than sentimental. Michael returned her smile, though his tone grew serious. It's not about sentiment, it's about legacy, and ours isn't just in what we've built, it's in the doors we've opened. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. For Michael and Elaine, the day was over. But the journey continued. They had traveled far, not just in miles but in the quiet, persistent work of changing minds, shifting perceptions, and planting seeds for a future they might not fully see. As they prepared for bed, Elaine glanced at Michael one last time. The hardest seats to hold, she said, echoing his words from years ago, are the ones we've already earned. Michael nodded, his expression calm but resolute. And the most important work, he replied, is making sure no one has to fight so hard to hold them again. With that, they turned out the lights, the quiet of the room enveloping them like the steady hum of the plane that had carried them here. Another step forward, another seed planted, another space quietly transformed by their presence. And tomorrow, they would begin again.